Ta-da! Thank you for joining me today over the airwaves of Google Hangouts on Air. Either you're listening to it on iTunes or Spotify after the conclusion of the live stream. If you don't know, now you know. This is the flyest, non-biased, ranked highest podcast you will hear on your Thursday afternoon. This is the Bottom Line Podcast, and I am the host of the Bottom Line Podcast, Davidson Baker. And I would like to thank you for joining me. Episode 51, the 21st MMA tailored edition of the Bottom Line Podcast. So the disclaimer comes as usual to those who are not familiar here at the beginning, just as it does on every other episode that's kind of theme-based. If you are not a fight fan or mixed martial arts fan or really have no interest in combat sports whatsoever, I'd go to another podcast now because we're going to be excuse me. We're going to be diving in to UFC 230, which takes place at Madison Square Garden Saturday night, live in the middle of the Big Apple. So as I try to get this shared up on social media right away, I would like to go ahead and say to those listening to this on audio only, I'm flying solo today. It's been the first time in a while I have flown solo on a podcast, but I got a lot I want to cover and felt as though that this was the right way to do it. So here we go. It's hard to kind of formulate where to begin when you begin to kind of dissect where we have come from on this windy road to UFC 230. And while the introductory thought, being given that narrative, already has you thinking, oh yeah, well there was this and there was this and there was that, and oh I didn't like this, and oh man, that sucked. Don't worry. Because I made a timeline in I cannot talk today. Chronological order of what needs to be told and what story will ultimately be uncovered when you look at what happened with UFC 230 when the history books are closed. So let's start here. July 7th, on the night of the UFC 226 broadcast, Miocic and Cormier, where obviously Daniel Cormier knocked out Stipe Miocic to become the second simultaneous two-division champ, blah, blah, blah. If you're listening to this and you like this, you already know the rest. The UFC announced that night on the Fox portion of the prelims, or the Fox Sports 1 portion of the prelims, I must say, the rest of the quarter 3 and quarter 4 schedule for 2018, with, of course, the bullseye pointed right at November 3rd at UFC 230 at the world's most famous arena, Madison Square Garden in New York City. 12 days later, on July 19th, Ariel Helwani reports the booking of the event's first fight, and it's a damn good one, in the middleweight division between Jacare Souza and David Branch, who had been kind of jawing with each other back and forth. And David Branch said he wanted to headline the last Brazilian card, it was the Sao Paulo card, the one right before UFC 229. Wanted to headline that against Jacare. Jacare needed a little more time, and that was booked subsequently for that. A few days later, the middleweight division's rollout on the biggest stage in New York begins to unravel as Brett Okamoto reports the booking of a rematch between Luke Rockhold and Chris Weidman, where Luke Rockhold obviously defeated Chris Weidman, fresh off of Weidman taking out Anderson Silva twice, for those that are kind of like the less casual or the more casual type of viewers, where Anderson Silva brutally broke his leg. Yeah, that guy, Chris Weidman. And Luke Rockhold were set to run it back after Rockhold took the middleweight belt. Weidman won from Silva in the first place, I believe back in early 2016, late 2015. Then the next day, the UFC with because here's how it works in MMA media. Someone says something that inclines someone else to obviously leak said information that becomes newsworthy. Nobody in media would have a job if there was nothing newsworthy out there, because people don't care about everyday stuff. We want to know as the consumer what is newsworthy. And somehow, some way, the idea of Yoel Romero and Paulo Costa fighting at UFC 230, when there had already been two middleweight fights announced between two top 10 guys at 185 pounds was either not newsworthy enough to where the UFC announced it before anyone else could say anything about it, or something was fishy, and we'll get back to that. So take us to July 30th. Brett Okamoto reports that the middleweight party is continuing to roll on in style, with Derek Brunson and Israel Adesanya being booked. So that made it into where, at that point, at the end of July, just a few days and during the fight week of UFC 227 in LA, we had a kind of a mini middleweight Grand Prix on tap for this card. You had Jacare Branch, Rockhold Weidman, Romero Costa, Brunson Adesanya. Then it starts to percolate. August 3rd. Not the night of August 3rd, but in the wee hours of the morning, right after August 2nd, turned into August 3rd, Lance Pugmire of the LA Times reported that Nate Diaz would be returning in the co-main event at UFC 230 against Dustin Poirier, who at the time of August 3rd was only 5 or 6 days removed from taking out Eddie Alvarez in a main event down in Calgary. And you know, if you watch that fight, how badly Dustin Poirier believed that he deserved the title shot next. And some might argue that he would, maybe, if he waited in line behind Tony Ferguson. I would be one of those people. But you approach Dustin Poirier coming off of a stretch where, I say this all the time, whether Justin Gaethje's World Series of Fighting World Championship is gratifying enough for you, that's your own thing. But technically, Dustin Poirier was coming off three straight, not only three straight stoppages, but three straight phenomenal performances that led to stoppages in 5-round main events against guys who held former lightweight world titles somewhere. Anthony Pettis, Justin Gaethje, Eddie Alvarez. That's a pretty solid case to fight for the title next. But if you were Dustin Poirier and Dana White calls you and says, hey, Nate Diaz, co-main event, MSG, you going to say yeah or no? You're going to have a pretty damn hard time turning that down. In my opinion, if it was me. And I think Poirier kind of alluded to that whenever they were in LA. He said he always wanted to fight at Madison Square Garden. Stuff like that. Then we have 18 more days and the raindrops begin to fall. Yoel Romero tells Ariel Helwani on his show that he will not be fighting Paulo Costa to kind of further cement the maybe not issues, but critiques isn't the right word either. Maybe skepticism of, how legitimate that fight was. And Romero comes on Ariel Helwani's show and says, yeah, not happening. Then we get about a month's time that goes by. John Jones given a reduced 15-month suspension from USADA. I know you're thinking, what does that have to do with UFC 230? Well, I mean, John Jones was pegged immediately. Like, you look at Twitter, immediately when John Jones was not so much vindicated, but given a slap on the wrist relatively from USADA, the 15-month reduced suspension, everybody was like, okay, that's it. That's the guy. He's going to headline UFC 230. Because let's rewind here. We are now in the timeline at September 19th. It started at the UFC 226 broadcast July 7th. There are the 4 big middleweight fights and the co-main event that have been booked, and probably a couple others. Still no main event. And it's been, not only has it been 10 weeks, you're running out of time if you're the UFC. Kind of a Woodley Till type of situation. They were running out of time, and they knew Woodley versus Covington was the next welterweight title fight that they should book, but they knew they had to do something. Anyway. So now, 6 days later, it is brought to the attention of the MMA fandom mania world that Nate Diaz and Dustin Poirier have oddly similar looking tweets that, oh my God, these are kind of significantly important. Nate Diaz and Dustin Poirier both, with Dustin Poirier kind of leading the charge, tweets kind of a subliminal message that would leave the man with the forward thinking to believe that they were going to be headlining at MSG now for the vacant and inaugural and rolling out the red carpet for the 165-pound weight class that a lot of people, not even fighters, but a lot of people that watch the sport, coach the sport, or around the sport have been calling for a very long time. Dana shuts it down in the same night. So we still don't have a main event. Now we're in October. We get to 31 days before the main event, and rumors begin to rumble around about Sijara Eubanks and Valentina Shevchenko for the vacant women's flyweight title to headline your crown jewel fourth quarter pay-per-view event in the world's most famous arena. Yeah, that don't sound right. Nope. Here's the thing, and I don't want to spend too much time more on this on the timeline before I dive into the fights. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to begin with that this fight became the main event. But then there were even more mitigating factors that you had to factor in. It doesn't make sense because, like, neither of those two have ever headlined a pay-per-view ever. Eubanks has never headlined anything, and Shevchenko has headlined on Fox like twice. Oh, and she did. Okay, I take that back. She headlined UFC 215 because Demetrius Johnson and Ray Borg fell through the day of the fight. And that was like one of the lowest selling pay-per-views in recent memory against Amanda Nunes. So the UFC puts all of their chips in on Shevchenko versus Eubanks to get a champion in the division and have him sit atop the throne at 125 pounds. After the disaster that was Nico Montano having to go to the hospital 2 months prior in Dallas. Where if you think back to that card in Dallas, this same exact thing happened. You ran out of time, and you scraped together a fight that not a lot of people had on their radar. Sure, Woodley Till was a good matchup and a fun fight to be hyped about. But Woodley versus Covington is the fight everyone wants to see at 170 pounds, and I think everybody knows that. And I think a lot of people are kind of puffing their chest and taking a deep breath that we will eventually get to see it, including myself. However, obviously, the outrage from the MMA fandom sphere sparked and went out of control. While I've already listed to you all of the mitigating factors as to what made this make even less sense, A, UFC didn't learn from what they did 2 months prior. And maybe that's because they were so focused and all in on Khabib and Conor, and if they were, more power to them because there were 2.4 million eyeballs on that fight card. More than any other fight card in the history of mixed martial arts. So, I mean, if that was the plan, it worked. However, they were staring a Shevchenko-Eubanks headliner in the face for an arena that had held its past two events as kind of flagship and historical, what's the word I'm looking for? Historical kind of benchmarks for the promotion's not even modern era, but like current era. I mean, you know, and we'll get into that briefly, but I want to finish this timeline. So the cherry on top of what even makes less sense here is Shevchenko is pulled from a fight with Joanna Jędrzejczyk, which is a fight I would argue that more fans probably would want to see. And Sijara Eubanks was pulled from a fight with Jessica Eye. 4 days later, UFC 229 airs in front of the largest in-home audience in the history of the sport, 2.4 million pay-per-view buys. Derek Lewis taking on Alexander Volkov. Alexander Volkov is battering him. He's kind of, I don't know, man. I mean, as I was watching that fight, it was really peculiar to me why Volkov would put his foot on the gas and he wouldn't per se slam on the brakes in the middle of while he was flurrying Lewis against the cage, but he was letting his accelerator he was kind of letting off the accelerator a little bit too much to where Lewis could kind of gather himself. I mean, if Volkov strings together continuous and ruthless pressure in his flurries that he was conducting throughout the fight, maybe once or twice, he wins that fight by stoppage. And Lewis looked exhausted. And then part to the body, overhand right, down goes Volkov with less than 15 seconds left. We all know. Did I mention that the UFC didn't say a single word about UFC 230 the entire night of UFC 229? The biggest pay-per-view of all time. They did not say one word. They knew Shevchenko-Eubanks wasn't their main event. And after Derek Lewis went inside that octagon and proclaimed that he took his pants off to Joe Rogan because his balls was hot, we had ourselves a main event in New York. The moment that happened, I don't want to say the moment that happened because I don't believe Dana White on a lot of things he says, but I do believe him when he says he doesn't make fights the night of the fight. He says it all the time. I think it's a very special case with this one, though. I think the moment that happened and the moment Derek Lewis said that, Dana probably looked at Sean Shelby, Mick Maynard, and said, hey, you guys thinking what I'm thinking? But we'll get into that. 3 days later, Cormier Lewis officially announced by the UFC, and then here's where everything begins to fall apart. On that same exact day as well, Dustin Poirier is ruled out of his fight with Nate Diaz. Diaz, who has not fought since the two Conor McGregor blockbuster events, is off the card, and his return still looms over the UFC. Rockhold and Weidman bumped to the co-main event, but not for long. Rockhold pulled with an injury, and that is only one of 4 injuries that scrapped 4 different fights in between the weeks of October 18th to October 25th. Not only that, the Rockhold injury scrapped Jacare versus Branch. So if you can remember at the beginning of the timeline that I had presented to you, you had the 4 fights in the middleweight division between top 10 guys, and one of them was number 2 versus number 3. Number 2 versus number 3. Rockhold versus Weidman. You had number 1 versus number 8, Romero versus Costa. Number 6 versus number 9, Brunson versus Adesanya. 5 versus 7, Souza versus Branch. Now, you have a pretty solid co-main event in Weidman versus Jacare. Number 3 versus number 5. you really only, other than that, have Brunson and Adesanya. As now David Branch will be taking on Jared Cannonier, who will be making his middleweight debut. And lost my train of thought. Obviously, Brunson and Adesanya. I didn't lose it. I just, didn't have anything else to say. These things happen when you do live podcasts. But regardless, you can say by a mile. And while most people in the MMA stratosphere who are a lot of people in the MMA world and the MMA community and MMA fans are very susceptible to being judge a book by its cover type of people. What do I mean by that? A lot of people don't want to open their brains. A lot of people want to sit there when watching from card to card and fight to fight and event to event, year to year. And you're going to remember the most about an individual what you saw first. And I get that. But a lot of people in the MMA community see a guy lose at first, he sucks. See a guy lose a round, he's going to lose the fight. May I remind you, it's mixed martial arts. May I remind you that the Jets can be beating the Bills 56-7. Bills can't walk into the end zone, score 49 points. Derek Lewis can land a KO shot with 15 seconds left after being brutally dismantled and what looked to be exhausted and beaten. One shot. What I'm getting at is the typical MMA fan, who I hope would not be one listening to this podcast, will look at the card and kind of hang their head and be like, "Oh man," like Swiper from fucking Dora the Explorer. Oh man. If you look at the card as a whole, though, I mean, yeah, it's no secret it doesn't stack up to the previous two Madison Square Garden shows. I mean, and that's a very unfair type of, build a fit given all the cancellations and how hard they've attempted to go at MSG since, MMA has become legal in New York. Obviously, it is no secret when you look at this card on paper and you look at the last two, 205 and 217, yeah, it's lacking. But there are some still great matchups. And obviously 205 2 years ago was a very special and momentous occasion. One of those types of very special and momentous occasions that are a grade above because you have already, as an organization, gone through a lot of very special and momentous occasions. And this one is a step above those. The sport had come so far in 20 years and change and had still yet to convince a few pencil heads wearing suits in New York that, hey, guys, 49 of the other 50, that when you count that, everybody but us has buried the hatchet with this thing. We should legalize it. And why it took so long to get legal in New York was not at all, and not a matter whatsoever, of a governing bodies or overseeing athletic commissions' respective practices of their own individual morality in which their state can provide entertainment. Basically, what I'm saying is this was not an effort in which the commission and the state of New York were saying, we are trying to do the right thing. Nobody tried to do the right thing. Nobody. What that was a couple of people a little bit higher up the pegs that had a personal issue. That had a selfish, no class type of personal issue. And eventually we broke through to that commission. And it also, it makes it absolutely zero surprise whatsoever that year in and year out, the commission, the athletic commission, while the UFC travels to dozens and several and repeats its occurrences and appearances in those commissions over and over and over again, it seems that time and time again that the New York State Athletic Commission has no clue what they're doing. And I mean no clue what they're doing. But it's gotten better, I guess. Jessica Aguilar being told she couldn't fight earlier this summer because she had chapped lips probably set it back, I don't know, a couple light years. But this isn't a UFC Utica podcast. So when the UFC broke the ground in 2016, it put on one of the biggest cards of all time, obviously, and could also be pointed to when the UFC first landed in Madison Square Garden, it prematurely almost ushered in the super fight era. It really did. We talk about it all the time now. You got Cyborg Nunes coming up. Cormier and Stipe was kind of a dead-end type of fight for Dana to make for Stipe's next title defense because there wasn't a whole lot of worthy heavyweight contenders after Stipe knocked off Ngannou in January. You had guys like Blades and Volkov that probably needed to get another win under their belt, and now they have, it's just become a lot more complicated. But yes, the trip to New York did kind of accidentally usher in the super fight era because Eddie Alvarez versus Conor McGregor for Alvarez's lightweight title was the first main event in New York City and the second ever champ versus champ fight, first since GSP versus Penn at UFC 94 in 2009. And now we've had a third with Stipe and DC, have a fourth booked in December with Cyborg and Nunes, and a potential fifth in January coming between TJ Dillashaw and Henry Cejudo. That card also had Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Thompson 1. That card also had Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz. That's 3 title fights. Also had Romero versus Weidman, Pennington versus Tate, Edgar versus Stevens, Khabib versus Michael Johnson. UFC 217 was also a historic night. First time in the history of the UFC that 3 champions fought on the same night and all lost their titles. And when you look back at that card, too, there were some bangers, man. GSP Bisping was a great fight. Garbrandt Dillashaw was back and forth. Joanna and Rose. We've seen both those rematches now go the same way. Wonderboy Masvidal. Paulo Costa's coming out party against Johnny Hendricks. OSP head kick against Corey Anderson. And hey, may I also mention to you, Curtis Blades and Alexei Oleinik, who are both coming off the biggest wins of their respective careers. They were the second fight on the entire card. Yeah. So with all of that being said, I mean, it goes without further explanation that, yeah, this card does not have the luster that the past 2 have. But that's fine. You know, UFC 224 was a thing. UFC 222 was a thing. I mean, think about International Fight Week last summer. Dude, talk about a cursed card. And they say the International Fight Week year in and year out is cursed. That card last summer, UFC 213, that card was cursed. Can't remember fully off the top of my head how many fell out. I know that Whitaker versus Romero for the interim middleweight championship became the main event. Shevchenko versus Nunes, the first time they tried it, didn't happen. Cerrone versus Lawler didn't happen. I know they wanted to do St. Pierre Bisping that night, didn't happen. No, they wanted to do Garbrandt Dillashaw that night, didn't happen. You get to save those 2 for MSG, but still. But this brings me to this. If you're going to be one of those people that sits at home and looks at the card and is like, nah, because you know it's at Madison Square Garden and you know it isn't a UFC 205 or UFC 217, get fucking lost, dude. Get fucking lost. Go outside, find some rocks, pick them up, look at them, put them back down again, and kick them. Because what are you even watching the sport for? This is a good card. This is a good card. However, I don't know what's going on in New York. Of the 2 pay-per-views to be held in New York this year, obviously, we all know about the cursed, not event, fight week that was UFC 223 in Brooklyn with Conor and the aforementioned brilliant New York State Athletic Commission pulling Max Holloway and aforementioned really smart and not dumb and not bad decision-making people at all New York State Athletic Commission telling Paul Felder he can't fight because Paul Felder isn't in a set of rankings that some people still rank people fighting in the ACB in. It's going to be okay. Random idiot who is not going to watch this card because he knows it's at Madison Square Garden and isn't as stacked as 205 or 217. It's going to be okay. It is. Let's get to breaking down some fights. Obviously, the main event going up between Daniel Cormier and Derek Lewis. Dude, there's not a whole lot to touch on stylistically here. I mean, everybody knows anything about watching fights that this is the style versus style that you're going to get. You're going to get a guy in Daniel Cormier who now in the latter end of his career, we're going to see the same Daniel Cormier that we saw win the Strikeforce Grand Prix, beat Frank Mir and beat Patrick Cummins in the early days of his UFC career at light heavyweight. Almost every Daniel Cormier you see is the same. He's pressing the action. He's moving forward. He's stalking his opponent. He's definitely looking to clinch against the fence and maybe working on a single leg. I thought Mark Ramundi said something very, very smart about Derek Lewis, though, today on the A-Side live chat on YouTube that I try to watch every week. Mark Ramundi, a writer at MMAfighting.com, said when his co-host Sean Al-Shadi asked him, is Derek Lewis, Sean Al-Shadi asked Mark Ramundi, Mark, is Derek Lewis a good fighter? Compared to the rest of MMA fighters in the UFC, is Derek Lewis a good fighter? Mark Ramundi said no, but he's good at fighting. I thought that was spot on. I thought that was right on the dot. It's hard to make. There isn't really a consistent trend with Derek Lewis's fights recently. And let's go back, starting with his first main event in Albany, New York at end of 2016 against Shamil Abdurakhimov. Not the most exciting fight. Guys got tired. Lewis looked out of it. And I know what you're thinking already. Trend, looked out of it. UFC 229, Volkov, balls was hot. Hold on. Lewis began to mess around with Abdurakhimov on the ground. Now, Derek Lewis can ground and pound, man. Derek Lewis, when he gets on top of you on the ground, man, he can ground and pound you into a pulp. But he'd rather be standing up. Because it takes a lot of energy to use hip control to keep these guys down, especially a heavyweight. The only reason Derek Lewis had Alexander Volkov in his line of sight for ground and pound is because Volkov was badly hurt. Lewis would have probably never been able to hold Volkov down on the ground with Volkov's ground game. I thought what Daniel Cormier said about Derek Lewis this week was interesting too at the open workouts. That he has a lot of admiration for Lewis, being an African American in his community that formerly did time in prison, and these are Daniel Cormier's words. Daniel Cormier said, this is not a direct quote, but this is along the lines of what Daniel Cormier said, and I thought it was really interesting, and I thought it was very true, and kind of a nice gesture from Cormier. When he said about Lewis, he said there was a lot of guys whether you are African American or you are white or wherever you're a man or you are a woman, and you find yourself hitting rock bottom like Lewis did sitting in that cell, and you tell yourself, I'm going to be this when I get out, I'm going to do this when I get out, I'm going to change everything for myself, and I'm going to do it because I'm the only one that can change everything around me because I'm the only one in control of it. And a lot of guys don't do that. But Derek Lewis did. I thought that was cool of Cormier to point that out. I also thought it was interesting that Daniel Cormier kind of lauded to the reporters to not be, quote unquote, fooled by Lewis. And I'm not trying to make this into a game of mental chess, but I do want to say that I did find it interesting that Daniel Cormier pointed out in the open workout scrum that he believes that Derek Lewis wants you to think he's ignorant. He wants you to think that he isn't the smartest guy in the world. He wants you to think that he's just outlandish and extremely over the top and can't control what he says because he doesn't know any better. But Derek Lewis is a very, very smart guy. Cormier said he's not going to fool him. And for Derek Lewis, here's the $1 million question. Were his balls really that hot? I doubt it. Here's the thing about Derek Lewis. Some of these guys that fight in the UFC and begin to find themselves into the upper echelon of their division, into maybe even creeping towards contendership, some of these guys have stuff they're going to say. And some of these guys have stuff they're going to say scripted, researched, rehearsed, fine printed, proofread, copied. They'll do whatever it takes to portray a fan-friendly or a consumer-friendly type of personality. Derek Lewis is not that guy. I guarantee you, when Derek Lewis said that he did not plan on saying that to Joe Rogan when Joe Rogan asked him, hey, Derek, why'd you take your pants off? My balls was hot. The 4 words that has taken the MMA world by storm ever since this fight was announced. I mean, even, you know, it got him over 500,000 Instagram followers. I guarantee you for a 100% fact, and I would bet the house on it, that Derek Lewis walked over to Joe Rogan standing there with the microphone, coming off the biggest KO and most improbable fashion of his career. And he did not plan whatsoever to say any type of specific set thing. Joe Rogan asked him a question. Lewis spitballed back to him. Remember, we're talking about a guy that said, where Ronda Rousey fine ass, where is Ronda Rousey's fine ass at after KOing Ronda Rousey's husband, then subsequently claiming and plotting to Brian Stan he almost shit his pants in the cage. You think this guy is planning stuff he says? He just had no idea that because they were in front of 2.4 million people, that it would earn him the spot. And I think it's a little harsh to say that that's the only thing that earned him this spot. Obviously, Derek Lewis has had a hell of a run. Maybe if you throw out the Ngannou fight, because nobody wants to talk about that. He had a blistering KO of March into Burra back in February. Again, I take pride in not looking up Tapology or Sherdog records while I try to spit these off. I'm trying to remember the last fight for Derek Lewis. I know it was supposed to be against Verdum. Can't remember if he fought before that, though. Anyway, as far as how the fight's going to go, I think there is some truth to what some people are saying about how Derek Lewis is probably better served without a longer layoff before a type of fight to this magnitude. I think it makes a lot of sense that Derek Lewis could very well be in the best shape of his life, despite looking completely exhausted and out of it and like he wanted to be anywhere but inside the octagon a mere, what, a little bit less than 3.5 weeks ago. I think there definitely might be some truth to that. I think that people are kind of downplaying the fact that that might play into his advantage rather than to play against him. However, Daniel Cormier is undefeated at heavyweight and is undefeated against guys not named John Jones, and I am just not ready to pick against that. I'm huge fans of both guys, and I'll be super happy for either of them no matter what if they win. But I expect Lewis to fade in the third and Cormier to take him down and finish him kind of similarly to how he finished Volkan Ozdemir. Maybe not in mounted crucifix, but some sort of position on the ground. So I like Daniel Cormier by third round TKO. So we're going to try to go fast here with the rest of these. Co-main event, Chris Weidman. Not a short notice fight for Chris Weidman or Ronaldo Jacare Souza, but both of them have a short notice schedule in terms of preparation for the individual they're fighting. And completely different style matchups too. Jacare going from Branch to Weidman, Weidman going from Rockhold to Jacare. I think that that dynamic of it plays very, very largely into the hands of Jacare. I think Jacare is a little bit, not more of a problematic matchup for Weidman, but more of a problematic matchup for a guy that is getting his opponent switched to face him on 2 weeks' notice, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think that – I think Weidman matches up pretty well with Jacare, actually. However, you need time to prepare for a guy as dangerous on the feet and especially on the ground. For those of you that are listening to this, if you've listened this far, you definitely know by now that Jacare Souza is world class on the ground. And Chris Weidman, a black belt under under Matt Serra as well. But is he Jacare's level? That's what I'm most interested in seeing. I'm really excited to see the grappling exchanges in this fight between how Chris Weidman, as an All-American wrestler and all this, and he's done this in grappling, going up against a real BJJ ace in Jacare Souza. I think the grappling exchanges in this fight will be one to behold, and I think it leads Ronaldo Jacare Souza to potentially a split decision. I think the fight could be very, very close. Could go either way. Weidman right now minus 195, Jacare plus 170. Originally slated to face Jacare was another Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, David Branch, who is ranked number 7 in the UFC's middleweight rankings at the moment. And instead of Jared Cannonier traveling down to Buenos Aires to take on Alessio Di Chirico in his middleweight debut, instead he gets a top 10 opponent coming off back-to-back losses. If you're willing, you're able, man. It'll be interesting to see Cannonier at 185. He's never made the weight before, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe he has, and as far as I know, he's never made 185. So I like David Branch all day, and I think he gets it done by submission in round 3. So moving on, also at middleweight. Yeah, we got heavyweight and then 4 middleweight fights. The heavyweight title and 4 middleweight fights, all leading up to the heavyweight title. But I have no clue why this fight is so high on the card. Carl Roberson and Jack Marshman is the second fight on the pay-per-view. It comes after Brunson and Adesanya. I don't get that, man. Like, I really don't. I think it should be high up on the card, maybe like featured prelim, but on the main card, not only on the main card, but in front of Brunson versus Adesanya. I don't know what they're thinking on that. I really don't. I've tried to analyze what they could possibly be doing with that. I don't know. I really don't. Both guys coming off a loss. I really, really don't know why that fight is so high on the card. Still a good fight, but should it be coming after Brunson and Adesanya? No, it shouldn't. Roberson brings an interesting style of submission threat to this fight, especially because Roberson's submission game is very underrated. I think a lot of people took notice when Carl Roberson stunned Ryan Spann on the Contender Series last summer with those short elbows. People forgot he's a submission threat too, and he wins them in all kinds of ways. Rear naked choke, arm triangle choke, arm bar. He's done it all. And I think he does it to Jack Marshman here. I like him by round 2 submission. Jack Marshman, you know, man, is one of those guys, like my friend Ryan Fortin said to me yesterday on Twitter, man. He's one of those guys that's in that awkward position in between 170 and 185. Brunson and Adesanya. This one will be fun. Brunson coming off back-to-back main events. He's headlined, I believe, 3 UFC events to this point without looking. Adesanya coming off kind of his coming-out party in his first main event. Adesanya was the first fighter in UFC history since Conor McGregor, so the second fighter ever in UFC history, and the first since Conor, to headline a UFC event in their 3rd appearance, and he looked dazzling. Now, I think Derek Brunson might put a little bit more pressure on Adesanya than Tavares maybe tried to. I think the fact that this is a 3-round fight and opposed to that fight being a 5-round fight might have something to do with that. However, man, if Brunson runs up with his chin up for even 2 seconds, he's gonna get banked. And it won't be pretty. I like Adesanya, and I think he gets it done early, 1st-round KO. FS1 featured prelim that takes you up right before the pay-per-view begins. So we have Jason Knight and Jordan Rinaldi. I think this could be a fight. I think this could be a fight where the guy that is not so lucky ends up on the chopping block, man. I believe Jason Knight's lost his last 3. Ricardo Lamas, Gabriel Benitez, and the split decision, hell of a fight with Makwan Amirkhani. And then Jordan Rinaldi, 1-2, making his featherweight debut in the UFC at plus 215 on the comeback from Knight at minus 255. I think Knight's a little more experienced and a little more polished. I also think Jason Knight is very, very dangerous while in guard, and that's where Jason Rinaldi is going to try to operate and get the fight to, I believe. I believe Jordan Rinaldi is going to try to get the fight to the ground and operate in Knight's full guard, which is dangerous. Knight, a very long and very lanky featherweight. I like Jason Knight by 2nd-round submission, maybe a triangle, something like that. Eubanks and Modafferi. Sijara Eubanks gets a title fight pulled right from underneath her and ends up fighting a girl she fought in the Tough House. It's the rematch between Sijara Eubanks and Roxanne Modafferi. Neither of these girls have yet to fight anyone that was not on the cast of the Ultimate Fighter season that they were previously on. Eubanks, of course, originally was supposed to face Nico Montano for the vacant flyweight title at the Ultimate Fighter 26 finale and had a botched weight cut, and then in-step Modafferi. So I think it goes a lot of the same. I think this fight ends up going a lot like the first one. I think Eubanks might be the most talented fighter out of that Ultimate Fighter cast. I really do. I think with her jiu-jitsu credentials and her very deceptive but yet still devastating type of power and elusiveness, not only power and the elusiveness that I've alluded to, but she's very deceptive on the feet. Whenever she does usually like to get the fight on the ground and operate out of guard, and especially out of the half guard. But man, she's very deceptive on the feet. That head kick she landed on Deanna Bennett on Tough was a thing of fucking beauty. I think Eubanks will get that title shot that she got taken away from her soon. Question is, though, how long? I think she gets this done, and I think she finishes Modafferi this time. 3rd-round TKO. Couple of interesting up-and-comers at featherweight between Julio Arce and Shayman Moraes. I think Julio Arce is the real deal, man. This will be another one of those. This one is kind of in that Weidman versus Jacare category where the grappling exchanges are going to be very fun to watch in this. I think Arce and Moraes are both excellent jiu-jitsu practitioners, but Moraes, in his last fight, where arguably he should have either been DQ'd or deducted points or whatever, against Matt Sales at UFC 227 with the eye pokes. You know, he and in his previous fight, you know, his debut was just against, you know, Zabit Magomed Sharipov, who's okay, I guess. It's all right. Julio Arce has looked phenomenal, man. Really dominating a guy in Dan Ige, who dominated his fight on the Contender Series and then also finished Mike Santiago in his UFC sophomore appearance in Chicago, like 60-something seconds into the fight. And Arce took care of him easily. Moraes has had a lot more difficulty in the octagon than Arce has, and I don't expect that to change. I like the Tiger Schulman man, Julio Arce, to get it done by decision. I applaud Ben Saunders for taking a short notice opportunity against Lyman Good. And in that welterweight bout, he said kind of the same thing that I would expect anyone that would be approached that opportunity to say. I mean, when are you going to be offered to fight at Madison Square Garden again? Maybe never. So props to Ben Saunders for taking that fight. Tough matchup for him, though. I like Lyman Good. On the Fight Pass prelims, I think this is a bad matchup for Matt Steamroller Frivola. I do think he'll be dropped 0-2 in the UFC, and he'll be treading water at that point. Lando Venata will get a much-needed win. Watch out for Shane Burgos versus Kurt Hollabaugh. I think that has fight of the night written all over it. I do like Shane Burgos by decision there. I like Montel Jackson to use his length against Brian Kelleher in a fight. Why? I'm not so sure why that's so low on the card. And then Adam Wieczorek on short notice, coming off becoming how about this? The only two men to ever secure an omoplata submission in UFC history on the same card. Ben Saunders and Adam Wieczorek. That's neat. That's awesome. Adam Wieczorek will take on Marcos Rogerio de Lima on short notice, and I think he gets that fight done by decision as well. So that just about does it for me today, guys. If you like this podcast, you like the content, go ahead and hit subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on iTunes, Spotify. Might be back tomorrow for another solo type of thing in the world of all sports. But one thing is for sure, the college football roundtable returns on Sunday with me and the guys. We'll recap Alabama, LSU, along with everything else. And I'll be back next week, MMA fans, to recap this. I will have a guest on the show. I'm not sure who exactly it's going to be yet. I have a couple of guys that I'm interested in having on. And if it's not one of the other, then the other will come on, I think, the week after. So yeah, should be awesome. Enjoy the fights, everybody. I would like to thank you for listening to this podcast and thank you for joining me. I will see you guys later. Until then, have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.